Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Friday's edition of Scotland at 7 on the 12th of March. First of all, before we get into the coronavirus update, let me introduce my two guests for this evening. Rejoining us on the programme after a short break is Siobhan Tolland. Hello, Siobhan. How are you doing?
Not too bad. It's been at least 4 days.
4 days seems like a week, Siobhan.
It
Anyway, also
surely does.
joining us this evening on the other side of the studio is actor Julie Coombe. Hi, Julie. How are you?
Hi there. I'm really good. How are you, Gordon?
I'm doing well. All the better for seeing the two of you. Let me get on with the coronavirus update first of all. And as of 2 o'clock today, a total of 1,734,614 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government's regional testing centres since the beginning of the pandemic. Of these, 1,526,185 have been confirmed negative. 208,429 have tested positive. There are 682 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. This, of course, will be an underestimate of the number of cases because not everyone with the virus displays the symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There were 17 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive today. The number of patients in Scotland who died from complications caused by COVID-19 infections now stands at 7,500. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 512 were in hospital last night, 38 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 1,844,636 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 149,409 have received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 125,343 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 175 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just to hospitals. Now to tonight's main news, and the police have confirmed the body found in Woodland is that of the missing Sarah Everard. They confirmed today that a body found in a wood outside London was that of Sarah Everard, whose disappearance has sparked anger and fears amongst women about their safety. Sarah Everard disappeared whilst walking home from a friend's house in South London last Wednesday, and police have arrested a serving officer on suspicion of her kidnap and murder. Her case has led to an outpouring of personal accounts by women of their own experiences and fears of walking the streets alone at night, and in a campaign for action to address this. Speaking outside the London Police headquarters on Friday, the Assistant Commissioner, Nick Fgrave, confirmed that a body found 2 days ago was that of the missing woman. Yesterday, detectives were given extra time to question the arrested police officer, who is aged in his 40s and whose job is to guard diplomatic buildings. A woman in her 30s, whom the media said was his partner, was released on police bail after having been detained on suspicion of assisting an offender. The police watchdog, the Independent Office for Police Conduct, has also launched an investigation into the handling of the case, as several days before Everard disappeared, the arrested officer had been reported over allegations of indecent exposure in a South London fast food restaurant. And now to news of Boris Johnson, and that Mr Johnson is preparing for a referendum he knows is unavoidable. The SNP has described Tory moves to shore up support for the union as proof that Boris Johnson knows an independence referendum is unavoidable in the event of a Holyrood majority for giving the people of Scotland such a vote. The Telegraph reports that the Prime Minister and other senior Tory ministers are engaged in ongoing strategy discussions as to how to combat support for independence, including Jacob Rees-Mogg's proposal that Westminster MPs take over the Scottish Parliament for 2 weeks, despite the fact that Holyrood won't be in recess. The SNP's deputy leader, Keith Brown, said, "This election comes down to a choice. Who should decide this country's future? Should it be the people of Scotland or Boris Johnson?" And now to Brexit statistics, which reveal a staggering drop in EU trade. Trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union was hammered in the first month of the new post-Brexit relationship, with record falls in British exports and imports of goods. Responding to the plunge in exports of goods from the UK to the EU, the SNP has said that Boris Johnson must answer for his reckless economic vandalism. The ONS highlighted a 64% fall in exports of food and live animals to the EU, including shellfish and fish. It pointed to delays caused by red tape, reported by the Scottish Seafood Association, with consignment sign-offs reportedly taking 6 times longer. The Home Office leaves thousands of refugee children in limbo. Children seeking asylum face inhumane delays to find out if they can stay in the UK after a 6-month target for handling applications was ditched by the UK government. Figures obtained by the SNP under Freedom of Information requests show that last year 3,500 under-18s were forced to wait for up to 5 years for an initial decision on their asylum claim. This compares with 406 7 years ago. The number of children waiting up to a year for a decision rose from 308 in 2014 to 1,232 in 2020. A UK government target of processing claims within 182 days was abandoned 2 years ago by the Home Office. Stephen Hale, the Chief Executive of Refugee Action, said the UK government is failing some of the most vulnerable children in the world. Other charities have warned that the lengthy wait can leave some struggling with depression and suicidal thoughts. The Greens say that the monarchy would hold Scotland back after independence. The monarchy is an outdated and discredited system that would hold back an independent Scotland, say the Scottish Greens. Commenting on the revelations and allegations of last week, Patrick Harvie, the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, said, "The revelations from the last few days and other recent scandals raise serious questions about the attitudes and values of the royal family and those around them. They also serve as a reminder that the monarchy itself is outdated, discredited, and a totally undemocratic institution." And now to the United States. The US Justice Department is to file 100 more cases over the Capitol attack. The US Justice Department on Friday said that it expects to file criminal charges against more than 100 additional people who allegedly participated in the January the 6th attack on the US Capitol in what it described as probably the most complex investigation that it's ever handled. More than 300 people already face charges stemming from the siege, which left 5 people dead and more than 130 police officers injured as thousands of supporters of the former President Donald Trump tried to prevent Congress from certifying his election defeat. The Justice Department made the disclosure in court filings, seeking 60-day extensions in some cases so that investigators can adequately pull together evidence. The investigation and prosecution of the Capitol attack will likely be the largest in American history, both in terms of the number of defendants prosecuted and the nature and volume of the evidence, federal prosecutors said in court filings. The FBI has been increasingly focused on suspects with ties to right-wing extremist groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. More than 900 search warrants have been executed in almost 50 states and the District of Columbia, prosecutors said. The US House has also passed 2 gun control bills. The United States House of Representatives yesterday approved a pair of gun control bills as Democrats seized upon a shifting political landscape, which they said provided chances for enacting new laws after years of failed attempts. The first measure, which passed the Democratic-led House 227 to 203, would close a long-standing loophole in gun laws by expanding background checks to those purchasing weapons over the internet, at gun shows and through certain private transactions. Only 8 Republicans joined the Democrats in backing the bill. The second bill passed 219 votes to 210, with only 2 Republicans supporting it, would give the authorities 10 business days for federal background checks to be completed before a gun sale can be licensed. Currently, such sales can proceed only if the government cannot complete the complicated background checks of prospective buyers within 3 days. President Joe Biden is a supporter of expanded gun control measures. The legislation may force a tougher battle in the US Senate, where Biden's fellow Democrats hold an even slimmer majority than in the House. And now, consultation on minor strike pardon. The Scottish Government is consulting on the detail of plans to pardon minors convicted of certain offences during the 1984-85 strike. An independent review into the impact of policing on communities during the strike, led by John Scott QC, recommended that the Scottish Government should introduce legislation to pardon minors convicted for certain matters related to the strike, subject to establishing suitable criteria. The Justice Secretary, Hamza Yousaf, has now launched a consultation seeking views on qualifying criteria for a pardon. And a launch of a new vaccination campaign. Unpaid carers who have not already been identified through Social Security data or general practitioner systems will be able to register themselves for a coronavirus vaccination appointment from next week. The new online service, which opens on Monday the 15th of March, is for unpaid carers aged between 16 and 64 who provide face-to-face care for a family member or friend. Carers who receive relevant benefits, carers allowance, young carer grant or child winter heating payment will be in our system and will receive a letter with details of their appointment. But all unpaid carers are being encouraged to self-register. When they do, they will be advised if they are already scheduled for an appointment, so there is no duplication. A Scottish Government marketing campaign will be launched next week to encourage all unpaid carers who are eligible for a vaccine to get one. The campaign will be supported by additional communications from local carer services and other third sector organisations to carers on their mailing lists. And now to the next section of the programme this evening. So I'm going to bring it back in our two guests, Siobhan Tolland and Julie Coombe at this stage, to talk about a revolutionary new piece of legislation which has just come to light, in fact, in the last 24 hours. And this is a new move by the SNP government. I beg your pardon. There is one item that I've forgotten to mention, and that is the violence against women debate is ongoing at the moment. Now, Shirley Ann Somerville and Professor Alan Miller, the co-chair of Human Rights Commission, are both been authoring this new human rights legislation. Violence against women and the elimination of it is top of the list in the United Nations conventions, which... Okay, I beg your pardon. With Sarah Everard's case so much in the news today, it has brought to the fore the worries of many women across the country about their safety when walking in public places. Now, let me turn to you first of all, Siobhan. As a woman, how safe do you feel walking around in Scotland streets at night? Is it something that you would naturally do, or would you have second thoughts about it?
If I'm absolutely honest, I probably haven't done that for quite a while, just given that I live in a very small village. But yeah, of course, when I was younger and out for an evening in the town and stuff like that, yeah, of course, it's something that every single woman, I would imagine, has considered at least one point in their life. I was just thinking about these incidents. There's been people talking about their experiences, over the social media and stuff. And, I was reminded of a time I was 18 and walking home from a party and got followed by a guy, and actually very, very kindly, I kind of asked this older man to kind of walk me home, which he did, because he knew that I was in a bit of a kind of state because of it. But it's that kind of thing that women have to deal with. This is ordinary for women, to be scared walking along the road. The kind of the scene that's kind of that seems to be coming up a lot is like holding your keys as a kind of defensive mechanism. I remember a woman telling me, I used to work where she was a judo expert, and she gave me advice on how to get out. A guy kind of coming at me from behind, and I always remember that when I'm walking along the road on my own. There is these little things, and it seems that it doesn't. To the outside observer, we're fine. We don't look vulnerable, but actually there is real vulnerability there. And you know what? The case with Sarah Everard is that this was a policeman and someone in authority, and it does raise the issues of who do you trust, and that's a terrible situation for us to be in. I also just quickly, sorry about Julie, but I also just quickly want to we've had an incident in Dundee here as well. We have a man who's been charged for the murder of a woman and her young 2-year-old child, Benelin Burke and her 2-year-old kid. They're searching for their bodies, and he was he was charged on Monday, and this happened in Dundee only last week. This is these are terrible events, and This woman, 25-year-old woman, met this guy, took it on trust, and then look what happened.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Julie, if I can bring you in at this point, what Siobhan is saying about the fact that women all seem to feel this anxiety and all, without exception, it seems, feel the need to do things like, learning about self-defense, carrying their keys with them. I mean, this is the 21st century. Men don't walk around the streets at night worrying that they're going to be attacked by women, do they? So what is behind this? Why is it that certain men, and this obviously is not all men, but why is this still present in the 21st century?
Um, well, I think I've seen an awful lot of things online about if you want to protect your daughters, educate your sons, and I think that's a very good point. But I am the mother of sons. In fact, boys can be not safe as well, I have to
Yes,
say,
that's
but I'm
true.
not going to go in. I'm not going to go into that
Yeah.
incident at the moment. I
Yeah.
had one of my sons was had an incident when he was abroad actually, and it was absolutely terrifying for him. But I mean, I'd just like to say very quickly about Sarah Everard. I can't say how sorry I am about what's happened to
Yeah.
that lovely lass. My family suffered a similar tragedy a long time ago where one of my cousins was taken in a very violent way. And it's not something that you get over. It's not
No.
something that a family ever gets over. Um, and I think in a way, I'd like to say it was shocking the amount of stories that have come out with women feeling unsafe, but it's not. And I think Siobhan would back me up. It's not shocking because it's not changed. I think there's a new kind of misogyny permeating society at the moment. I
Yeah.
think it's with a
Hmm.
kind of general list to the right,
You think it's
and
becoming more acceptable in the eyes of many young men to behave this way?
in a way, yes. I think there's a kind of cheapening of an attitude towards women, and I'm not talking that I'm not saying that every man would kidnap someone off a street and do some, but we're talking about microaggressions and
Yes.
all the time, and how if that's not picked up on, if there's if there's no education,
Mm.
it's just if it's funny, and I think we have to watch. Obviously, I do a lot of comedy, and I think you have to watch what you make appropriate
Yeah.
with comedy, acceptable, and if there is sort of violence and aggression towards women, no matter how small or large, if you make that acceptable, in my book, that is not acceptable because that's picking that scab of that horrible
Sure.
aspect of
Sure.
humanity that says, all right,
It's okay to behave
game
this
on,
way. Yeah.
yeah.
Siobhan, can I bring you back into the conversation for a minute? One person yesterday I noted was suggesting that men should also be educated in how to behave if they are walking behind a woman at night and the kind of things that they can do to remove the fear for that woman who's walking ahead of them. For example, to cross the street or to stop and make a mobile phone call or appear to make a mobile phone call. Ways in which men can behave differently in order to reduce
Yeah.
the fear that women have of walking when perhaps there is a man walking behind them, perfectly innocently perhaps. Are there things that men could learn to do, you think, that would help?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I think that the mark of, I think, a gentleman is perhaps recognising that when they're walking along the road. But if I'm honest, I do think that we do the situation a disservice if we start looking at maybe perhaps individual men and individual women's behaviour. I think we have to look at the kind of larger social structural processes here.
Yeah,
And it fits in with what Julie was saying, this shift to the right, the shift to the kind of more authoritarian style government, certainly that Donald Trump brought in, for instance, and kind of swept across the West, it often does come with increased misogyny. That's one of the signs of an increasingly totalitarian society. We have state structures that enact violence against women. The rape clause, I would say, would be a
Yes.
violent act against women in that respect. We have an encouragement of violence and war from our states, and which sexual violence is often used as a tool of
In
war
warfare, yes.
by countries and nations against other countries. So there is this wider structure of misogyny and violence that is kind of bred from the society and the structure that's in. So yes, a gentleman would recognise, I think, and it is a good idea for us to, kind of say to guys, look, that would be useful for us, but we do need to start. It's much more than that. We wouldn't need to be scared if there wasn't a culture of deep-seated violence from the state structure down.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't need to ask guys to go to the other side of the road, please, because we wouldn't necessarily be scared, because we wouldn't be living in a culture that thinks actually violence is normal, not just violence against women, but violence generally. We build up our army to become violent people against other countries.
Yeah.
We've come from an empire structure where historically we've used violence to get what we want from other countries. So, there's a long history there that's caught up in a racism, and it's caught up in a misogyny as well. So for me, there's much, much deeper seated issues, and I think we need to start looking at it on those wider issues, because I think we'll never get to the core of how we change those things without understanding where this is all coming from.
Actually, you have just given me an excellent entry point into our next piece of news this evening, which is this remarkable new human rights bill, which is being proposed by Shirley Ann Somerville of the SNP, which the SNP plans to introduce world-leading human rights legislation, and it's just been announced by the Equality Secretary, Shirley Ann Somerville, today. Subject to the outcome, obviously, of this the May elections this year. A new human rights bill will incorporate 4 United Nations human rights treaties into Scots law, including legislation which enhances the human rights for women, disabled people and minority ethnic communities. Now, the new bill will be introduced in the next parliamentary session and will include specific rights subject to devolved competence. Now, these 4 areas, I've listed them in an order which I think will work with what we've just been discussing. The first one is violence against women, and the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women is what the first part of Ms Somerville's bill will cover. Now, in the first of 4 United Nations Conventions on Human Rights, this legislation will guarantee the rights of all women in Scotland. What I'd like to ask, I think first you, Julie, I'd like to ask you this question. How will having a Scottish human rights bill affect how women can obtain justice if there is proven discrimination towards them? What will it allow them to do you think, that they can't currently do?
Well, I think an awful lot of people, and probably myself included, are a little bit ignorant, and not willfully ignorant. Just you talk about things in a kind of a large way of the Bill of Human Rights, but you
Yeah.
don't actually know what's on the Bill of Human Rights.
Nobody knows what's actually in it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this proposal of putting everything in the one place, to me,
Yeah.
makes absolute perfect sense. And I think along with it is going to become there's going to come a campaign of education, and I think it's about people knowing what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and what they then can take action against. And it's making that action accessible. And
Yeah.
if this new bill makes that possible, then I think that's an absolutely vital thing for women. Quite often, like a lot of things, Gordon, you never find out what is available to you until you're in absolute in extremis,
Yes. Nobody gives
until
you a guidance towards how to obtain
yeah,
these things.
until you need it. And I think that we need a sort of bigger, a blanket approach to educating people as to what they should accept, what they should expect
Yes,
for
what should be theirs
for
by
life.
right. Yeah.
Aha, aha.
Well,
And if good Good
Okay, Julie,
dialogue.
well, let's take that a step further. And one of the things, if I come to you, Siobhan, for a moment, one of the things which occurred to me when I was reading this press release is that having a written bill of human rights, particularly for women, it doesn't matter whether it's for women or other categories of people, but specifically for women, this is going to become a little bit like having a constitution, isn't it? Because you're going to have a written set of rights and responsibilities for everyone, which everyone can access and everyone should know about. Which means that I suppose that it might be possible for a woman, for example, who works for, let's say, a British government department in Scotland, who has a problem at work, a problem of discrimination, that she could actually sue the British government in a Scottish court, or go to a tribunal, an employment tribunal, and win it because she has these written rights. Do you think that's a realistic prospect?
Um, it's a kind of slightly strange one because I think there'll be a lot of other issues that we can maybe push forward here. But yeah, I suppose it would be. I think the good thing about this is that it does make anti-discrimination actions much more possible.
Yeah.
I mean, the kind of the UN convention that it's based on is very broad, and it covers reproductive rights, it covers anti-violence and so forth. So it's a very kind of broad-based,
Yeah.
rights-based analysis of what discrimination might be, and that ranges from access to good childcare, it ranges from good job opportunities to anti-violence, so forth as well. But there's something, I think, it reminded me of this beginning of the wellbeing economy that we're beginning
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah.
And it kind of flips that. It flips how we see society on its head. And I was reading an article earlier on, for instance, if you think back to the notion of kind of violence against women, for instance, what you've got is that there will be a legal obligation on state structures to provide support and assistance to women, for instance, fleeing domestic violence. Now, if you think, domestic violence has increased since 2010. The austerity agenda has made it worse. Cuts to women's aid, cuts to refuges, and so on and so forth. Cuts to benefits has made it more difficult for women to leave abusive partners and so forth. So what you've got is this flipping of the obligation to help women and
Yeah.
support women in those structures. I think that picking up on what Julie said, and I think it's a really good point, that there is an element perhaps where it's hard, and I am experiencing that as well, Julie, but it's hard for us to see that and apply it to ordinary everyday society.
Yeah.
And I think what might be quite useful is actually the SNP doing some work on what that might mean for ordinary everyday
Yeah.
life. For women, it's a really good opportunity to embed human rights and put people first and put women first. And how we explain that and how we educate, as Julie says, how we educate society on that, be really interesting. It's the beginning of something great, I think.
Yeah.
Let's hope so, Siobhan. Julie, just to expand on what Siobhan was saying, this new legislation, and we have to assume, first of all, that the SNP will return a majority government to actually enact this, but let's assume that they do this. Do you believe that this is going to be the start of a process rather than being the conclusion of a process? Because this, I believe, was started in 2018. The committees which were looking at this and drew up their conclusions have now presented this. How much do you think comfort and confidence do you think women will get from this legislation, knowing from the first instance that this is a United Nations convention which is being applied? It's not just Scottish law, although it will be Scots law, but ultimately it could go before the United Nations or an international court if it was something serious. How much confidence do you think that will give women, knowing that that backup is there?
Well, I think that Siobhan could, I'm sure, will speak much more knowledgeably than me about this, but I think we're at a really interesting time politically, and it's kind of where we are as a nation, but it's also where we are with this pandemic.
Mm.
We're at this point where we can build back we need to build back, and we have the opportunity to build back and improve, build back better. I think I saw that somewhere, and this is the beginning. It's a brilliant beginning. I think, I hope that the SNP return a majority. I think this is a very important thing. If the SNP return a majority, I think it's an even more important thing if the SNP don't return a majority, because I think we as a country, we as women, as citizens of this, of
Yeah,
this
you're
world,
51% of the population.
yes, we need to. It, I feel that the UK is receding from an internationalist outlook, and
Yes, it
I
has actually
think that we
said that
need to
that's what it's going to do.
yeah. And basically we are getting the jump on that, and I think it would, me as a woman, it will give me a lot more confidence to know that I'm being looked after by the bigger global community, and it can, the potential is there, not just for it to be a dead end in
Yeah.
Westminster,
Yes.
so I think it's tremendously exciting, actually. I think, yeah, we're in a good place.
Well, that's interesting, Julie. You mentioned the fact that it might be even more valuable if the SNP didn't succeed in getting a majority. But let me turn that the other way round and put it back to you, Siobhan. Let's assume the SNP gets its majority. We go on and have a referendum and we vote for independence and we get it. How important is it going to be when we found a new country that the foundations, the constitution foundations, are based on the rights of everyone? And as you say, the well-being of everyone in the country, rather than measuring the success of the new nation as GDP, as the UK does.
I mean, I think that agreed with Julie there is that's what makes it exciting for me, is that that is the building blocks of what can be a brand new structure. And, we talked a bit about, when Julie's been saying it as well, same as me, that the shift to the right that's occurred recently across the Western world. But what we've had is this continuous dehumanisation process that's occurred over the last 3-4 decades, probably increasingly so. Just this constant demonisation of groups across the globe, demonisation of various different groups within society. And I think what this does is it begins the process of rehumanisation. And I was just finishing an article, literally just finished it the other day, on that process of dehumanisation and how we can begin to rehumanise. And then this came, and I thought it was exactly that kind of thing that I had in mind, integrating human rights into the absolute bare bones of the society, so we can start building that outwards, because I do think that there's a lot of strife, there's a lot of, we're increasingly more violent, we're increasingly more unequal. If we start with those basic rights, and one of the other, the fourth tenet of this human rights bill is also the right to housing, the right to good social security, all that kind of those rights as well. But what we've got is this structure where people begin to build their worth again. And you know what? The state begins to encourage human worth again, because what we've had, especially through Westminster, is this constant, quite consistent stripping away of our human rights and our humanity, almost to a certain extent, to be slightly melodramatic about it. But this builds something new and rehumanises for me, and it's great, and it does make it very exciting, and it gives us a taste of what we can do.
Well, let's hope you're right, Siobhan. It certainly is an exciting time to be alive. And, that old Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times, is traditionally viewed as a curse. But in this case, I think it could be a blessing, perhaps. Anyway, I'd like to move the conversation along to the next part of this new human rights bill, and that deals with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Now, this is obviously very topical at the moment. We heard recently, in fact, we were delivering the news yesterday on the on the Floyd trial and the former police officer accused of his murder. Um, it's it's very topical at the moment, and this new bill sets out under United Nations legislation to eliminate racial discrimination. But do you think, Julie, first of all, do you think that this will hasten the ending of what you might call learned racial stereotyping and attitudes? Is this the beginning of the end of that inculcated sort of low-level racism that people seem to have just lurking in the back of their psyche at the moment?
Um, I don't know if it'll be the end of it, because people are people, and people are by nature quite tribal. Um, we've been having an awful lot of discussions about this very subject within my own union,
Yeah.
equity, and got a young actor who sits on the committee, who is the only person of colour on the Scottish committee. And it's been incredibly edifying to hear his point of view. And he's been on this independent commission for racial equality within the union. Um, I actually said to him, are there any white people around that table? And he
Yeah.
said, no, actually, and I think what there was a problem with it, because it had become sort of different ethnicities kind of jockeying for their own piece of turf a little bit. And I was saying, are there any white people? Because how are we going to become educated if that becomes a person of colour thing?
Uh-huh.
If it's that's all.
So do you think
So
that, the committee itself was sort of segregating itself and becoming a little ghetto within
Yeah,
equity?
almost. And we had the whole Lawrence Fox debacle earlier on
Yes.
as well, where yeah, which was a horrid time. But yeah, that I think so. It was becoming that's a their issue, and I think
Mm.
if we are going to seek an end to to racial discrimination, it can't become a their issue or an our issue. It's got to be. It's the issue is shared. The responsibility is shared. Um, I'm really proud of my sons, because they've gone through university and they've done the whole kind of the equalities training and things like that, because they've both been involved in theatre societies, and
Hmm.
and if you're an officer in one of these things, you do this training, and they are so much more educated than I am. The education is there. It's about people's willingness to accept it. And I think as a society we are hopefully moving towards, especially in Scotland, moving towards a sort of more widespread education. But I think also we have to acknowledge that it is a problem. There is
Yeah.
racism in Scotland. It's not good enough to say there isn't. Oh no, we don't do
Yes,
that.
we're
We
not
do.
paragons of virtue here, are we?
No, no.
Anyway, let me come back to you, Siobhan. My next question is one which also occurred to me when I was reading the proposed legislation. Do you think, or should or will there be, do you think, public funding made available, particularly to poorer migrants or perhaps asylum seekers, who may have a strong case of racial discrimination to be fought in the courts and tribunals? Should there be, and do you think, or do you expect that there will be public funding being made available to help fight such cases?
Um,
When you create
I,
a
I mean, I
law,
hope.
you need to create a way to enact it. I was just thinking that maybe people who are victims of such discrimination may not have the financial backing to pursue something in court.
Well. I mean, I would hope so. I mean, one of the problems that the austerity agenda created was a kind of a reduction in legal aid, which was obviously going to be problematic for a whole host of equality issues. But I think that there's a lot of issues before you get there.
Hmm.
There's the issues of language, there's the issue of cultural difference, and not understanding what routes would be available to you. I think maybe it might be more productive to also, because what you would need, of course, is good information, accessible information in various different languages that would mean that people can understand and have that conversation in their own language, if that makes sense. So I think before we even get there, then there's a lot of other public service work that we would need to do.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the UN Convention is very clear about is that it doesn't matter whether you're legal, or not, if that makes sense. It doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or not, you're still entitled to the human rights, if that,
Yes.
you know what I mean?
You're still a human
so
being.
there is that well, exactly.
So they're
Exactly. That's
inalienable
pretty much what
rights
it
that
comes down
belong to everyone.
to. But we've got that notion of, helping people get to that stage. I also think, though, this is not just about people going to the court. Often
No.
it's just one case that tests that law, if that makes sense.
Breaks a logjam for everyone else.
Well, exactly, and it kind of sets precedents and stuff. It's setting a cultural precedence. It's much bigger than going to court. I think it sets a cultural process of this is what's acceptable and this is what's not. And it goes back to what Julie was saying. I think that it's that notion of it resets us. It educates us on what the boundaries of behaviour is, actually. And I think that's why it's the start, isn't it? It kickstarts that process and allows it to. Sometimes the legal, the legalities of things, it takes a while for it to have a cultural impact. And I think that's what's kind of so good about this here. It's not just the legalities, it's the impact on what that might have on how we exist and function within society.
Of course, racial discrimination takes many forms, and it's not just overt. It's not just people calling each other names or violence against people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds. There is also this sort of racism of omission, where people are neglected, or where, for example, they're trying to get a job, they don't even make it onto the shortlist because their face doesn't fit. How on earth are we, Julie? How are we going to try to change people's attitudes so that stops happening?
Well, I mean, in my own industry, in acting, basically, theatre and TV, there's been a lot of trying to address that balance with blind casting, some of which I think works brilliantly, some of which is not so successful. But I don't know. I think it's about acknowledging that it was there in the first place. It's about acknowledging that there was a lot of people say. So an issue. My friend who's on the committee is an Asian. He's a Scottish Asian, and he was saying that he's found a lot of the issues within equity is that diversity in London stops at black actors. They don't take into consideration the Asian actors because of the number of black people who live in London and the number of black members that there are. And I think it's about acknowledging that but people of colour haven't had the same opportunities. I mean, one of the most important things that I saw last year, and it wasn't really my scene because I'm not a millennial. You might have guessed that with the lines and all that in the face. But
no, you are.
No, you might have guessed that.
Okay, we'll take your word for that.
There was I think it was called "I May Destroy You," and it was by that brilliant girl Michaela Cole.
Yes,
and she had an enormous amount of control. She wrote it. She, I think, had a huge hand in the casting. She had a production credit as well.
Yeah.
And I thought, gosh, she has found some incredible black actors.
Yes, I watched that drama. It was very good.
Whereas I think sometimes there's a little bit of patronising, we need a couple of black faces or we need a couple of Asian faces. Whereas that girl assembled, a really top quality cast, and it showed us that, it was brilliant. It was just good, and I don't know how you do that in industry that's not my industry. I don't know whether it's like the equivalent of blind casting where you don't
see the person's face, you just hear them.
There's that. I mean, maybe that's what to do, but I think we have to acknowledge that it's there and be willing to change it.
Let's hope so, Julie. It certainly is going to need a bit of education all around, I think. Let me steer the conversation on to the next topic that's covered by this new human rights bill that has been proposed by the SNP, and that is the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Now, disabilities is a big blanket term, isn't it, Siobhan? It's a term that people tend to think of people in wheelchairs when they think of disabilities, people with walking frames. And it tends to normally be this perception that disabled people just can't get around. But of course, there are all kinds of disabilities. And disabled people, I think it's fair to say, face the same kind of stigmatism, the same kind of discrimination in many ways that that ethnic minority citizens do, in that they tend to be dropped off shortlists. They don't make it to job interviews because they're weeded out early on as being disabled. How on earth do we change the attitudes of employers, first of all, to show them and educate them that disabled workers can be as good or better than their able-bodied counterparts?
I think that, just to kind of clarify that I actually work as a disability advisor in a higher education institution, and I've worked in various ones. I also have a disability as well, and I did, I have experienced considerable discrimination as a result of that. So it's kind of coming from that angle, I suppose. The good thing about the UN Convention, and I think the good thing about the UN Conventions generally, and the fact that the Scottish Government are embedded in this, is that it brings in a social model of disability.
Yep.
So that, in a sense, for the viewers that perhaps don't know, the medical model would be that you're basically you're viewed as your disability. So it's that kind of like, I've got Addison's disease, so it would be considered, it would be my endocrine system that would be kind of making me disabled. But the social model of disability effectively turns it on its head and said, it's not that physicality, it's not that kind of, mental health problem, etc. It's the impact of society on that person. It's how society treats
Views
that
them,
person.
yeah.
So, the individual, the institutional disability, discrimination that occurs across society. And that is, and you're right, most people look at disability as being in a wheelchair or being physically disabled. I had a colleague who had arthritis and she was the age of 8, and she would always say to academics that wouldn't want to put in support you, but you date for somebody in a wheelchair. It's that kind of thing, because it's like that's what they understand. But there's a whole host of subconscious, unconscious bias there. There's a whole host of difficulties, and there is also an element of what you would class as the unseen, which is what I would be considered, an unseen disability. Whereas I look perfectly healthy, people look perfectly healthy. They can look healthy one day and then the next day they can be floored. So there's that element there that most of the students I work with that have what you would class as an unseen disability would basically tell me that it's people's attitudes that's the biggest barrier
Would you
them.
say, Siobhan,
that?
Sorry, Siobhan, I was going to ask you, would you say that there's an element of fear amongst the general able-bodied population that when they encounter someone with any form of disability, they're scared to engage with them? They don't know how to approach them. They see the disability first and they have a phobia about it. Is that, do you think, a factor in this?
Sorry, you were kind of looking at Julie, so I wasn't sure if
Oh,
you got
sorry.
my name.
Yeah, I beg your pardon. I tend to be looking the wrong way sometimes. Carry on, Siobhan. Yes, I shouldn't be looking the other way.
I think when you start to other a group of people, and there's plenty of groups of people who are othered, then fear's often used as a tool, isn't it? Because we don't know, we don't understand, so we're just not quite there. Maybe I think it's maybe a bit more subtle than that, though. I think that, for instance, I kind of work with a lot of dyslexic students, and if you take the job interview situation that you were talking about earlier on, it would be that kind of, there's no fear there, but there's the stereotypes and assumptions. Oh, they clearly can't spell. There was a big saga a few years ago about nurses that couldn't, couldn't
Yeah.
count, kind of thing. Dyslexic nurse. Well, I mean, it's not true. It's stereotyped, and it's kind of, it's building on false information. And I think we often take that into interviews. We often take that into society. I mean,
Yep.
it's how we counteract it. Well, you know what? You start with the Human Rights Convention for the protection of disabled people, and then you embed it into your infrastructure for a new independent society. So
Yeah.
there's a start there, and again, it's that cultural process. Sometimes on an individual level, it's because if we don't know something, we are a bit scared. If we don't understand it, we are a bit scared. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that it comes back to this rehumanization process, isn't it? We always seem to stratify society. Some are better than others. Some are kind
Yeah.
of better
Pigeonhole
than
everyone.
others. Some are, exactly. And disabled people are often seen as being weak and being,
Or a burden.
kind of not quite fit for society. That's
Yeah.
how the culture often kind of comes across. It is clearly false, it's patently false, but there's those stereotypes that are there before you've even started a conversation sometimes.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much for that, Siobhan. I'll try and look the correct way next time I ask you a question. Anyway, let me look the correct way to talk to Julie now. Julie, we talked about unseen disabilities, and one particular disability that I know a lot about because I suffer from it is deafness. And one of the things about deafness, which most people don't realise, is that deaf people become become socially isolated because they can't participate in the conversation because they don't know what's being said. They can often hear the sound, perhaps, but they don't know what people are saying. And sometimes that's misconstrued as rudeness. Or ignorance, and people actually have sometimes shunned deaf people because they misinterpret their behaviour. How do we change people's attitudes to that kind of unseen disability? Is it going to take a big program of education, do you think?
I think it will. I mean, I don't know. Siobhan is so knowledgeable about all this with
Yeah.
her work, that I hope, that she'll agree with me that, it is going to take a huge programme of education. For instance, I think, even myself, I have to confess, like we're in the process of setting up a new organisation at the moment, and we were contacted by somebody who said, have you thought about hearing impaired people? And we all kind of pulled ourselves up short and said, no, we haven't. We haven't. And this person does sign language and all that. And she said, well, I would be more than happy to help. And I thought, yes, please come and educate us and help us and tell us what we need to do to be completely inclusive. And it wasn't that any of us wanted to exclude anybody. But we were guilty by omission. We had just forgotten. We had just, we were so busy trying to do this, do that, to put this literature out, get this right. And we had forgotten that some people need other things other. And so we ourselves, who think of ourselves as very, all-encompassing people and very thoughtful, we hadn't thought of that. And so I think people do have to be taught to think ahead, what does everybody need here? And can we give them it? So I'm afraid I had to confess on that one, but we're addressing that.
Okay, Julie, listen, stay with me for the moment because the next question is also aimed at you. Now, the fourth pillar of this new Human Rights Act is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now, what I wanted to zone in on this particular subject was cultural rights. Now, Scotland has suffered many cultural bans and attempts in the past, in past centuries, by British forces to kind of obliterate our languages, our culture, even our clothing, actually. And despite all of these attempts at cultural assimilation, we've often, refused to hate our own language and our own accents and our standards of moral and social responsibility. We've kept it all. How will this new legislation, do you think, help to protect us from any future attempts at sort of cultural vandalism or cultural assimilation? Will it protect us, do you think, in the way that we want?
Well, I hope it will offer us an added protection. In the setting up of this new organisation, we have been talking quite a lot about that and how um, we've almost been, well, not almost, we have been made to feel like second class citizens because we're Scottish. Don't use your Scottish words. Don't use this. And I think we are all becoming even more proud of Scottish dialect, and
Yeah.
we are becoming very cognizant of just how different we are culturally and geographically, because you know that we've been having this ongoing battle within our own union
Yeah.
of really a lack of understanding of what Scotland is. And I hope that if we know that, as you say, constitution is there, that will give people who are becoming more and more proud in these aspects of our culture
Hmm.
and our heritage and just us as a nation. Um, if we know that backstop's there, that maybe will give us the confidence to say, no, that's what we're like, and
Yeah.
let's love it. Let's love that aspect of ourselves.
Okay, Julie, thank you. Siobhan, let me come to you for sort of final comments on this evening's discussion. We're talking about, well, I was talking earlier on about cultural assimilation way back, in the 1700s. But um, if the Scottish government, as it is at the moment, the SNP government, is not re-elected in the elections in May, it looks like we're going to be facing another attempt at cultural assimilation by Boris Johnson's government. The idea of obliterating everything with union flags and pouring money into whatever the British government sees fit. Will this, do you think, help us to resist that?
Um, I think I would be less concerned about cultural assimilation because that's more of a longer term structure. I'd be
Hmm.
more concerned about political assimilation in terms of the kind of the stripping of the Scottish Parliament and the devolution and so forth. Although I kind of take your point.
But
I
do you
think
not
that
think it
the
comes under?
UN Convention is much wider ranging
Well,
than
it covers
protecting
economic and
Scottish
social
culture.
subjects as well, Siobhan, doesn't it?
Sorry.
Sorry, it covers economic and social issues as well, not just the cultural rights.
Yes, it does. It's quite significant in terms of its anti-poverty
Hmm.
legislation
Yeah.
is as well, and that's something that for me is significantly important. I think that in terms of Scottish culture, well, I Julie might know this better than me, but there is a process of Scottish culture, literature, and arts that has helped us define our identity. That's moved into that's allowed us to become the independence movement that we were. The beginning of
Yeah,
the
there
Scottish
was a,
National Party in the 20s come from the literary revival and all that kind of thing. So there is that element of there can be great a resurgence, perhaps, in Scottish culture. Um,
well,
if the SNP lost this election, then I think that there'll probably be a dip
yeah,
in that because I
certainly,
think that I think there'll just be less vivacity. I think to
yeah.
our thought processes, and we'll be a bit just more depressed in our creative output, perhaps.
Well, certainly, I think it's fair to say about both of you that after the 2014 referendum, there was an explosion of Scottish culture, especially on social media amongst independence campaigners, and that has continued right up until the present day and is continuing to expand. So let us hope that it continues to do that. And Broadcasting Scotland, of course, is a part of that, and we want to remain a part of that and to grow as Scotland grows. Anyway, we've just about run out of time, I'm afraid, for our discussions tonight. Thank you both very much for your excellent replies to my seemingly strange questions sometimes. Um, But it just remains for me to remind our viewers that, of course, we're in the middle of a crowdfunder at the moment. And if you would like us to continue to expand the cultural blossoming of Scotland by becoming the major independent broadcaster for Scotland, you can do so by helping us by becoming a supporter of Scotland, of Broadcasting Scotland, by following the instructions that are on your screen now. That just remains for me to thank both of my guests this evening, Siobhan Tolland and Julie Coombe. Thank you both very much. I hope to see you again soon. And so from the three of us and all of us here at the studio here in Cowcaddens, a very good night to you.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes,
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.